January 1945, Western Germany. Just beyond a shattered tree line, inside an American M4 Sherman, the air is thick with cordite and burned oil. The engine roars unevenly, straining under frozen ground and cratered mud. Steel vibrates as another impact slams into the hull, sharp, metallic, unmistakable. A German Panzer round. Then another. The crew does not shout. They do not panic. Each man stays locked into his role, hands moving from habit rather than thought. The driver adjusts position by inches. The gunner tracks shadows through a narrow sight slit. The commander scans the hedgerow, reading terrain more than enemy silhouettes. 12 hits will be counted later. At this moment there is only pressure inside. The armor and outside it. German gunners expected fire and collapse. Instead, the Sherman remains, scarred, shaken, still moving. Smoke pours from scorched paint. Shrapnel rattles across the turret roof. Yet the tank does not burn. This survival will not be explained by thicker steel or superior firepower. It will be explained by something far less dramatic and far more important, shaped by the brutal reality of how American crews actually fought this war. Because to understand how this tank stayed alive, we first have to understand the battlefield it rolled into. By January 1945, the war in Western Europe had entered a brutal, grinding phase. The initial shock of the Allied landings in Normandy was long past. The dash across France had slowed. Supply lines stretched thin. Winter tightened its grip on roads, engines, and men alike. American armored units were no longer advancing into lightly defended territory. They were now fighting deep inside Germany's defensive belt against prepared positions, experienced panzer crews, and terrain chosen deliberately to negate speed and numbers. German doctrine had always treated tanks as hunters. Panzers were expected to strike from concealment, engage at distance, and withdraw before retaliation. Their gunnery emphasized first shot kills. Their crews trained to exploit optics, camouflage, and superior armor angles. On paper, this gave German panzer units a lethal advantage. American doctrine was different. U.S. tanks were not designed as solitary duelists. They were instruments of combined arms moving with infantry, artillery, engineers, and air support. The Sherman was not built to outgun German heavy tanks in head-on combat. It was built to move, to be repaired quickly, and to fight again tomorrow. This difference in philosophy would shape everything that followed. By late 1944, German crews had learned to expect easy victories against Shermans. After Normandy, countless after-action reports described American tanks as lightly armored and flammable. German propaganda reinforced the idea. So did battlefield experience when conditions were ideal, but conditions were rarely ideal. Terrain in Western Germany favored defense. Forests, villages, narrow roads, and broken hills limited sight lines. Snow and mud reduced speed. Urban rubble created unpredictable angles. Long-range engagements, the environment German tanks preferred, were often impossible. At the same time, American armored divisions had evolved. Early mistakes had been paid for in blood. Crews learned quickly that survival depended less on armor thickness and more on discipline, positioning, and movement. Tank commanders learned to think like infantry officers, using cover, reading ground and refusing unnecessary exposure, that by January 1945, many American crews were veterans. They had survived France, the hedgerows, the Siegfried Line, and the opening stages of the Ardennes counteroffensive. They had learned to fight while outmatched on paper. German forces, meanwhile, were under growing strain. Fuel shortages, limited training, and maneuver. Replacement crews were younger and less experienced. Ammunition quality varied. Even when a Panzer round struck true, penetration was not guaranteed, especially at awkward angles or reduced velocities caused by distance, weather, or rushed firing positions. The myth of invincible German armor began to fracture under these realities. American tanks were rarely alone. Even when separated visually, they operated within a web of support radio coordination, overlapping fields of fire and rapid reinforcement. A Sherman under fire was not simply a target. It was a node in a larger system. This system rewarded crews who stayed conged inside the tank. Survival depended on repetition. Drill after drill turned chaos into routine. Drivers learned to feel terrain through vibrations. Gunners adjusted aim instinctively. Commanders made decisions in seconds, when to advance, when to reverse, when to hold. German crews often underestimated this adaptability. They expected fear to do half the work. When a Sherman took a hit and did not retreat, it disrupted expectations. When it took a second hit and continued to maneuver, it created hesitation, and hesitation in armored combat was deadly. The engagement that would later be described as surviving 12 Panzer hits did not begin as a legend. It began as another winter patrol, another push into contested ground, where American armor advanced not with confidence, but with caution, learned the hard way. Because by this stage of the war, survival was no longer about who had the strongest. It was about who understood the battlefield better, and that understanding had been forged long before the first round struck steel. By the winter of 1944-1945, American tank crews no longer viewed combat as a test of machines. They understood it as a test of endurance, mental, mechanical, and tactical. Every mile east carried lessons learned under fire, and those lessons reshaped how Sherman crews approached. German armored training manuals had not prepared them for what the European battlefield demanded. Reality had. Crews learned that exposing a tank's full profile, even for seconds, invited destruction. They learned that stopping was often more dangerous than moving, and that moving too fast could be just as fatal. Terrain became their first line of defense. American tank commanders were taught to think in 3 dimensions. A shallow rise in the ground could mask a hull. A bomb crater could provide partial defilade. A hedgerow, a wall, or even a burned-out vehicle could break an enemy gunner's sight picture. Crews began to fight the ground as much as the enemy. German Panzer doctrine emphasized clear lines of fire and decisive shots, but winter stripped away many of those advantages. Snow reduced contrast. Smoke from artillery and burning vehicles lingered in the cold air. Visibility narrowed. Range estimation became harder. Engagements collapsed into close, confused encounters where reaction time mattered more than gun caliber. The Sherman's weaknesses were well known. Its frontal armor was thinner than that of many German tanks. Its silhouette was higher. Its Gun, depending on the variant, struggled against heavy armor at long range. But those weaknesses were magnified only when the tank was used incorrectly. American crews learned not to fight German tanks the way German tanks wanted to fight. Instead of meeting fire head-on, Shermans maneuvered laterally. They angled their HULs not to stop rounds outright, but to reduce penetration probability. Even a slight change in angle could turn a penetrating hit into a glancing blow. At oblique angles, German rounds sometimes shattered or deflected, damaging equipment without killing the crew. Equally important was movement discipline. Crews avoided predictable patterns. They advanced in short bursts. They reversed as often as they moved forward. A tank that stayed still long enough to be bracketed by enemy fire rarely survived. Communication inside the tank became critical. The commander's voice, calm, controlled, set the tempo. Panic spread faster than fire. Crews that trusted each other moved faster, reacted sooner, and wasted fewer seconds debating under pressure. Outside the tank, American logistics played a quiet but decisive role. Damaged Shermans were often recovered and repaired within hours or days. Crews knew this. Survival did not require finishing the battle. It required staying alive long enough to fight again. German crews faced a different reality. Fuel shortages, restricted movement. Recovery vehicles were scarce. A damaged Panzer often meant a permanent loss. This pressure pushed German gunners toward aggressive engagement, sometimes firing sooner than ideal, sometimes from imperfect positions that urgency could be exploited. A German Panzer firing from a rushed position was more likely to miss or strike at a poor angle. A Sherman crew that recognized this could choose to absorb limited damage rather than expose themselves to worse risks by retreating blindly. Armor survivability was not binary. Tanks did not simply live or die. They endured partial damage, broken optics, damaged tracks, spalling, shaken crews. The question was whether the crew could continue operating. American crews were trained to fight through damage. A hit did not automatically end the engagement. Unless fire broke out or the gun was disabled, the tank remained a fighting vehicle. This mindset unsettled German expectations. Repeated hits that failed to destroy a Sherman forced German crews to reassess. Each round fired revealed position through muzzle flash and smoke. Each second spent reloading gave the American crew time to adjust, reposition, or call support. In this environment, survivability became cumulative. One correct decision reduced risk. Another multiplied it. Over time, those decisions added up to something that seemed improbable from the outside. The engagement that would later be described as surviving 12 direct hits was not an anomaly created by chance. It was the product of accumulated doctrine, hard-earned experience, and disciplined execution under fire. And once the shooting started, those elements would be tested from multiple angles, at once human, tactical, technological, and psychological, because the battlefield does not judge intentions, it judges reactions. Inside a tank under fire, fear is not loud. It is tight and controlled. American tank crews learned early that panic did not announce itself. It crept in through hesitation. The men inside the Sherman understood that survival depended on routine. Each crewman focused narrowly on his task, blocking out everything else. The driver felt the terrain through the seat and pedals, responding to shouted commands with small, precise movements. The gunner tracked not tanks, but flashes, tiny breaks in shadow that hinted at enemy guns. The loader worked by muscle memory, ignoring the ringing in his ears. The commander watched everything, calculating risk with each second. Hits did not mean defeat. They meant assessment. Is the tank still mobile? Is the gun functional? Is there fire? If the answer was yes, the fight continued. Veteran crews had learned that most kills happened after panic, when tanks fled blindly, exposed weak armor, or stalled under stress. Staying calm was not bravery. It was survival discipline. Each impact tested that discipline. Tactical angle, fighting the ground, not the gun. The Sherman's survival was not based on armor thickness. It was based on how the crew used space. Rather than advancing straight toward suspected panzer positions, the crew moved laterally. This reduced the chance of clean penetrations and forced German gunners to adjust aim constantly. The tank rarely presented a flat surface. Its hull and turret were angled just enough to complicate penetration. Terrain was used deliberately. The tank hugged shallow folds in the ground, exposing only the turret when possible. Rubble and tree lines disrupted German sight lines. Smoke, both accidental and deliberate, created moments of uncertainty that the crew exploited. Movement was measured. Short advances, immediate reversals, never lingering in one position long enough for German gunners to range in. Each hit the tank absorbed told the crew something. Angle, distance, direction. A round that struck and failed to penetrate revealed the enemy's firing position. Smoke from the gun betrayed location. The crew adjusted accordingly. In armored combat, information traveled faster than armor thickness. Enemy angle, German expectation versus reality. German Panzer crews were trained to expect results. Their doctrine emphasized decisive kills. When a target failed to burn after the first hit, confusion set in. Each unsuccessful shot forced a reassessment. Was the angle wrong? Was the range misjudged? Was the round defective? Winter conditions complicated everything. Cold steel, variable propellant performance, and obscured optics. German gunners began firing more rapidly, sacrificing precision for urgency. That urgency exposed them. Each muzzle flash gave away position. Each shot narrowed options. The idea that an American tank could absorb repeated hits contradicted German assumptions. The Sherman was supposed to die quickly. When it did not, the psychological balance shifted. The German crew was no longer hunting. They were reacting, and reaction, under fire, favors the side that remains composed. These three forces, human discipline, tactical movement, and enemy miscalculation, did not operate independently. They fed into one another. Calm allowed better positioning. Positioning forced enemy errors. Enemy errors reinforced crew confidence. As the engagement continued, new pressures entered the fight: technological limits, command decisions, and the moral weight of survival under overwhelming fire. Those forces would shape what happened next. German tank guns were powerful, but power was conditional. Penetration tables assumed ideal conditions: flat armor, known ranges, stable firing platforms. The battlefield rarely provided any of these. cold weather reduced propellant consistency. Optics fogged. Crews rushed shots under pressure. Angled armor reduced effective penetration, even when steel thickness was inferior. A hit that looked decisive on paper could become survivable in reality. The Sherman's design emphasized mechanical reliability. Even when damaged, systems often continued to function. Turret rotation slowed but did not stop. Engines sputtered, but stayed alive. Tracks damaged by near misses could sometimes hold long enough to reposition. German rounds that failed to penetrate still caused shock. Spalling chipped metal inside the tank. Crewmen were bruised. Equipment broke loose. But survivability was not binary. The tank remained operational as long as the crew could function. Technology did not decide the outcome alone. It created margins. The crew decided how to use them. Leadership angle. Decisions under seconds. American tank commanders were not isolated. Heroes. They were junior leaders trained to think independently. When higher command could not see the battlefield, they made decisions in seconds. The commander in this engagement did not seek glory. He sought survival. Orders were short, clear, no debate. Reverse. Angle left, hold, fire only when clear. Each decision balanced aggression and restraint. Advancing risked exposure. Retreating risked turning the weaker rear armor toward the enemy. Holding position risked being ranged in. Leadership meant choosing the least dangerous option repeatedly. German commanders faced a different problem. Communication disruptions, fuel shortages, and fragmented units limited coordination. Individual Panzer crews were often operating without immediate support. A failed kill became a personal problem, not a shared one. That isolation increased pressure and mistakes. Moral angle. Survival without myth. Later accounts would describe the engagement as extraordinary. At the time, it was simply exhausting. There was no sense of invincibility inside the Sherman. Every hit reminded the crew that steel could fail. Survival did not feel heroic. It felt temporary. American crews did not measure success by enemy kills alone. They measured it by survival, by the ability to keep moving, to protect accompanying infantry, and to be present for the next fight. German crews faced a moral strain of their own. When superior weapons failed to produce expected results, confidence eroded. Repeated failure under pressure undermined the belief that technical superiority guaranteed victory. This erosion mattered. War is not decided only by equipment. It is decided by belief that actions still matter, that decisions can still change outcomes. By continuing to fight, by refusing to collapse under repeated hits, the American crew asserted that belief. As the engagement wore on, the balance shifted subtly. German fire continued, but with less precision. American movement continued, but with growing clarity. The battle was approaching its decisive phase, because at some point, endurance forces a reckoning, and when that moment arrived, both sides would feel it. The engagement did not end in a single dramatic exchange. It tightened. Snow and churned mud muted sound beyond a few hundred meters, but inside the Sherman every impact was amplified. The crew counted hits without speaking. 1, 2, 3. Not as numbers, just as moments of confirmation that the tank was still alive. That German fire intensified. The spacing between shots narrowed. This was no longer deliberate ranging fire. It was urgency. A Panzer gun fired from a partially concealed position beyond a low rise. The round struck the Sherman's glacis plate at an angle, screeching across the armor before exploding harmlessly away. The tank rocked. The driver corrected instinctively, backing into a shallow depression just deep enough to mask the lower hull dot. Another shot followed, this time from a different direction. The German crew had shifted position, attempting to bracket the Sherman. Their assumption was simple. Sustained fire would finish the job. Inside the tank, the commander made a calculation shaped by experience rather than optimism. The enemy was firing faster. That meant reduced accuracy. It also meant increased exposure. He ordered the gunner to hold fire. This decision was not passive. Firing would reveal position more clearly and invite concentrated retaliation. Instead, the Sherman became a problem the German crews could not solve quickly. As minutes stretched, the pattern became clear. German gunners were adjusting based on previous impacts, each adjustment slightly off because the Sherman refused to remain still. The tank advanced a few meters, reversed, pivoted, angled. Never enough to invite a clean shot. Always enough to disrupt aim. Another hit struck the turret ring. The impact jarred the turret, momentarily slowing rotation. The loader steadied himself against the recoil brace. The gunner waited. The commander checked for smoke or flame. None came. The Sherman moved again. German crews began firing from suboptimal positions. One Panzer exposed itself briefly while attempting a flanking shot. The movement was spotted not by optics alone, but by the disturbance of snow and exhaust, heat and cold air. The American gunner fired once. The shot was not intended to destroy. It was intended to disrupt. The round struck near the Panzer's track assembly, forcing it to halt and withdraw behind cover. This was the turning of the pressure. German crews were now managing multiple problems. Ammunition expenditure revealed positions and the unexpected resilience of their target. Each additional shot carried diminishing returns. Another Panzer round struck the Sherman's side armor. At close range, penetration was possible, but the angle was imperfect. The round detonated outward, showering the hull with fragments, but failing to breach the fighting compartment. Inside, the crew absorbed the shock. The commander issued the same order he had given repeatedly. Hold. By this point, the German gunners had expended a significant portion of their ready ammunition. Resupply under fire was impossible. Each miss mattered more. The Sherman, damaged but mobile, continued to deny them a decisive result. The battlefield had shifted from firepower to endurance, and endurance favors the side that understands when not to rush the end. As German fire slackened, just slightly the moment approached when survival would no longer be passive. It would become decisive. The reduction in German fire was subtle, but unmistakable. The intervals between shots widened. Smoke no longer appeared from multiple positions at once. What had been a coordinated effort was fragmenting into isolated actions. Inside the Sherman, the commander sensed the shift before it could be measured. This was the moment American crews were trained to recognize not victory, but opportunity. The tank edged forward, just enough to change the geometry of the engagement. Not a charge, not a retreat, a calculated reposition that forced German gunners to reacquire their target entirely. One Panzer attempted to re-engage from a new angle. The gun fired, the shot striking high on the turret. The impact cracked external fittings and stripped paint, but the armor held. The German crew had rushed the shot. That rush was the signal. The Sherman's gun fired again. This time the target was not the tank itself, but the ground near its firing position. The explosion threw dirt, snow, and debris into the air, obscuring optics and forcing withdrawal. The message was clear. Continued exposure carried consequences. German crews now faced an unwinnable exchange. Their shots were no longer precise. Their positions were compromised. Their target refused to break. The 12th confirmed hit came moments later, a final attempt to force destruction through persistence. The round struck, failed to penetrate, and detonated away from the hull. The shock rattled equipment loose inside the tank, but the engine continued to run. And then silence. Not total silence. The distant sound of artillery. Engines elsewhere. On the front. But from the immediate threat, the guns that had targeted the Sherman-nothing. German Panzer crews disengaged. Some withdrew to avoid being bracketed by artillery or air observation. Others repositioned deeper into defensive cover. The engagement was over not because one side had been annihilated, but because one side had lost the initiative. The Sherman remained, scarred, dented, shaken. Alive. The crew did not celebrate. There was no moment of relief, only confirmation. Systems check, ammunition count, communication to nearby units. The tank resumed its role. In armored warfare, survival is rarely marked by cheers. It is marked by continued movement. Later inspections would document the damage. Multiple impact points, deformed armor. External systems compromised but repairable. No penetration of the fighting compartment. German records from similar engagements reveal frustration rather than disbelief. Reports noted American tanks that absorbed fire and refused to burn. Not miracles. Problems. This was not an accident of chance. It was the outcome of doctrine meeting discipline under pressure. The Sherman did not win the battle alone. It did something more important. It denied the enemy success. And in a war defined increasingly by exhaustion and attrition, denial was often decisive. As smoke settled over the battlefield and units reorganized, the consequences of this survival began to ripple outward through morale, through tactics, and through the quiet recalculations happening on both sides of the front, because every engagement leaves a trace, and this one would be studied. When the battlefield quieted, the evidence remained in steel. Inspection teams documented the Sherman's hull with methodical precision. Impact points were marked, angles measured, penetration assessed. Each strike told a small story about distance, trajectory, and decision-making under fire. The conclusion was not dramatic. It was technical. None of the rounds had achieved a catastrophic penetration. Several had struck at oblique angles. Others had lost velocity due to range or terrain interference. A few detonated prematurely against fittings or armor edges. The tank had suffered damage but not defeat. For American commanders, this mattered, not because it validated a single engagement, But because it reinforced patterns seen across the Western Front, Shermans were not invulnerable, but they were not disposable either. When used correctly, they survived far more often than enemy assumptions allowed. The cruise. Survival had immediate psychological effects. Nearby infantry units, who often judged safety by the condition of their supporting armor, pressed forward with greater confidence. The presence of a functioning tank, even a damaged one, changed how ground was held. German units recorded the engagement differently. In reports, emphasis shifted from armor superiority to operational difficulty. References appeared to American tanks absorbing fire and remaining operational after multiple hits. These were not admissions of failure. They were acknowledgments of a changing battlefield. German commanders faced a dilemma. Ammunition shortages and fuel constraints meant prolonged engagements were costly. Tanks could not afford to duel endlessly. A failure to destroy a target quickly risked exposure to artillery, air attack, or encirclement. The engagement reinforced a trend already underway. German Panzer units increasingly avoided isolated fights unless conditions were favorable. Defensive tactics emphasized ambush and withdrawal rather than prolonged engagement. For American armored doctrine, the lesson was equally clear. Survival under fire validated the emphasis on combined arms, movement discipline, and crew training. Tanks were not expected to win alone. They were expected to endure long enough for the system around them to function. Repair crews recovered. The Sherman within hours. Damaged components were replaced. Armor scars remained. The tank returned to service. This cycle engagement, damage, repair, return, was central to American operational strength. Industrial capacity allowed losses to be absorbed. Training allowed crews to be replaced or reinforced. Doctrine allowed adaptation without hesitation. German forces lacked this margin. A damaged Panzer often meant permanent loss. A surviving American tank meant continuity. The aftermath of the engagement did not appear in headlines. It appeared in quieter places, training briefings, after-action reports, and the collective memory of crews who learned that survival was possible even under concentrated fire. Those lessons spread. They shaped how American units advanced in the final months of the war. They influenced how German units chose when and when not to engage. And they set the stage for the broader consequences that followed as the Western Front continued its slow, relentless push eastward, because individual survivals do not change wars by themselves, but patterns of survival do. As winter turned toward early spring, the consequences of engagements like this one became increasingly visible across the Western Front. American armored units adjusted their expectations not toward invulnerability, but toward calculated resilience. Crews understood that survival was achievable when discipline held and doctrine was followed. This understanding altered behavior. Tank commanders became more deliberate. They trusted terrain. They trusted movement. They trusted the system around them. Reckless charges became rarer. Controlled advances became standard. German Panzer units, facing mounting pressure, adapted in different ways. Fuel shortages worsened. Replacement crews arrived with limited training. Tactical patience became harder to maintain under constant Allied pressure. When an American tank refused to burn, It disrupted more than a single engagement. Disrupted tempo. Tempo mattered. The inability to destroy targets quickly forced German units into reactive postures. Artillery calls increased. Withdrawals became more frequent. Defensive lines shortened. Each adaptation traded initiative for survival. The Sherman's survival also influenced American leadership at higher levels. Evaluations of tank losses became more nuanced. Instead of counting destroyed vehicles alone, analysts examined time to destruction, crew survival rates, and recovery timelines. The data supported what crews already knew. Survival was not random. This reinforced the American approach to industrial warfare. Tanks were tools, not symbols. They were expected to be damaged, repaired, and returned to combat. The emotional weight placed on individual vehicles was secondary to operational continuity. For German forces, the emotional weight was heavier. Each loss mattered more. Each failure to destroy a target represented wasted resources that could not be easily replaced. The psychological toll compounded over time. By 1945, German reports increasingly described American armor not as inferior, but as persistent. That persistence was difficult to counter with dwindling resources and shrinking strategic options. The engagement that had once been a test of firepower faded into the larger pattern of the war. Its significance lay not in its uniqueness, but in its representativeness. It showed how modern warfare had shifted, not toward singular decisive duels, but toward endurance, logistics, and adaptability. Victory belonged increasingly to the side that could absorb punishment without collapsing. The American Sherman, scarred but functional, became a symbol of that shift, not because it was the best tank on the battlefield, but because it fit the war being fought. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, such survivals accumulated. Each one eroded German confidence and reinforced American momentum. And when the war finally ended, it would not be remembered solely for the power of weapons, but for the systems that kept men and machines functioning under relentless pressure. That understanding would shape armored doctrine long after the last shot was fired, because in the end, the war was decided not by single moments of destruction, but by the quiet, repeated refusal to be destroyed. In the years after the war, photographs of destroyed tanks would dominate memory. Burned hulls, twisted steel, silent machines frozen in time. They told a story of violence, but not the whole one. What often went unseen were the machines that survived. The Sherman that endured 12 direct Panzer hits did not do so because it defied physics or fate. It survived because modern warfare had changed. Armor thickness alone no longer determined outcomes. Training, discipline, terrain, and decision-making mattered just as much, often more. This engagement revealed a truth that military planners would study for decades. Survival was a system. It was built from logistics that replaced losses, doctrine that valued cooperation over duels, and leadership that trusted crews to make decisions under pressure. For the men inside the tank, there was no sense of legend. There was only fatigue, relief measured in continued movement, survival measured in minutes and meters. For the German crews who failed to destroy it, the moment was equally instructive. Technical superiority meant little without control of conditions. Power without endurance could not shape outcomes. The Western Front was filled with moments like this, rarely celebrated, often forgotten, but decisive in accumulation. It did not end the war in a single stroke. They wore it down by the time the fighting stopped. It was clear that victory had not belonged to the side with the strongest weapons alone, but to the side that understood how to keep fighting after absorbing damage. The Sherman's scarred armor was not a symbol of invincibility. It was a record of adaptation, and in a war defined by exhaustion, adaptation proved stronger than steel.